For so many, President Obama was a son of Africa, and his presidency held this incredible promise for the continent. But what if that promise wasn't just unfulfilled? What if, and this is a pretty provocative analysis, his administration actually, paved the way for China's dominance? That's the controversial claim we're unpacking today.
Okay, let's just dive right in. I mean, look at this. The analysis we're digging into doesn't mess around. It lays its cards on the table right away with this absolutely explosive line. It frames everything that follows.
So, you gotta ask, right? How do you even begin to back up a statement that bold? Well, the argument is built piece by piece, starting with this idea that this wasn't some accident. Nope, it was the direct result of policies that basically left a huge door wide open.
So the core of this whole thesis, it's not just that China's influence grew while Obama was in office. That's kind of obvious. The assertion is way stronger. It's that the administration's policies directly created an economic vacuum. And guess who was ready and waiting to fill it?
All right, so let's get into the evidence. How does this analysis build its case? Well, it all starts with some pretty stark numbers and a massive contrast in how these two superpowers decided to play the game. Let's get into the economics and see how the case builds from here.
First up, let's just look at the raw data. I mean, the sheer scale of the economic shift is, it's jaw-dropping. By 2013, trade between China and Africa had just exploded to $200 billion. And the US number for that same period? Just $85 billion. We're talking less than half. Those numbers are just staggering.
And get this, that massive gap was already there, firmly established by 2013. We're talking right in the middle of the Obama presidency. So the sources use this timing to argue that, look, during this period, the US wasn't just being outpaced, it was kind of being left in the dust as Africa's main economic partners shifted, and shifted decisively toward Beijing.
But here's the thing. The analysis claims this gap wasn't just about money. Not at all. It was about the entire philosophy, the whole approach. And it really boils down to two completely different ways of doing things, which the analysis frames as a clash: lectures versus blueprints. So here's that first clash, laid out plain and simple. On one side, you've got the US approach, which the sources call the moral policeman. The focus was all on democracy, human rights, and social values. And on the other side, China, positioned as the no-judgment partner, with a strict policy of not interfering in another country's business. Their message was simple: we're here to build, not to preach.
And that difference in philosophy, it led to two very, very different offers on the table. The US approach often came with strings attached, demands for reforms or progress on certain social issues. China, though, they just showed up with the blueprints and the cash. Fast loans, no political conditions, no sermons, no lectures. The sources point to one key moment that they say is the perfect example of this clash. It's Kenya, 2015. President Obama's there, and he publicly pushes for LGBTQ+ rights. Well, the pushback was instant, and it was public. The Kenyan president, standing right beside him, just flatly says these are a non-issue for his people. For the authors of this analysis, that single moment captures the entire problem.
And that exchange? It just seemed to crystallize a feeling across the continent, which was captured perfectly by this line that apparently went viral at the time. This quote just sums up the choice that a lot of African nations felt they were facing. Do we take the lectures from the West or the railway from the East?
Okay, so that difference in philosophy had huge real-world consequences. And that brings us to the next point: bureaucracy versus bulldozers. The US model is described as that classic teach a man to fish idea. It's slow, it's careful, it's risk-averse. China's model, by contrast, it was more like, forget fishing, we'll build you the entire fish farm. It was all about speed, massive state-led projects that you could actually see and touch.
And that visibility, man, that was absolutely crucial. The point the sources are making is that people could literally see the results of China's partnership. So for many folks on the continent, the choice was just pragmatic. As one resident in Addis Ababa is quoted as saying, "Human rights won't pave our roads." I mean, that quote really captures the fierce debate happening inside these countries.
Okay, so we've got a clash of values, and we've got a clash of methods. The third and final piece of this argument, according to the sources, is all about attention, or really a lack of it. The claim here is that the US was just so focused on other parts of the world that it basically sent a message to Africa: hey, you're not our top priority.
And a key piece of evidence for that is the famous pivot to Asia. Now, from Washington's point of view, this was a big strategic move to focus on China's rise in the Pacific. Makes sense, right?
But the sources argue that the message received in Africa was completely different. It was heard as, the U.S. is looking somewhere else now.
And to really hammer this point home about neglect, the sources bring up a single stark number. Just one. 2.
What's 2? That's the number of presidential visits to sub-Saharan Africa in 8 years. And the argument is, when you put that number up against the almost constant flow of top Chinese leaders visiting the continent, well, the contrast is just jarring. It sent a powerful signal that for Washington, Africa was more of an afterthought.
So, okay, where does all this lead? What's the final verdict from the sources on this whole era? Well, to put it bluntly, it was a massive, massive opportunity lost for the United States.
And what's really striking here is the final comparison the sources make. They argue that in some parts of Africa, President Obama is actually seen less favorably than his predecessor, George W. Bush. Why? Well, the reason they give is that Bush's legacy was tied to these huge, tangible health programs like PEPFAR, things that saved millions of lives. Obama's legacy, on the other hand, according to this analysis, was seen as being more about symbolism and, well, lectures.
And this quote, which they attribute to an anonymous African minister, just captures the entire argument perfectly. It frames that pragmatic choice leaders felt they were facing in the most direct way you can imagine. The whole point of the analysis is that this big power shift wasn't some historical accident. It was the direct result of deliberate policy choices.
And that leaves us with the final, very pointed question that this analysis poses. The narrative we've just walked through, it seems to suggest a pretty clear answer, doesn't it? But as this global competition for influence keeps changing, it's a critical question for every world power out there. At the end of the day, do actions always speak louder than words?